Hi, everyone. Welcome to Food Talk Live. I'm your host, Danny Nierenberg. Every Monday, we'll be talking to leaders from food and business who are doing incredible things. And one of the sectors that I've been reading a lot about lately is the plant-based milk sector, which has been growing steadily over the last few years. And according to the Plant-Based Foods Association, now represents 14% of the milk category. And sales grew about 5% in 2019, while dairy sales remained flat during that time. And during the pandemic, plant-based milk sales have grown even more as consumers are concerned about certain things like health. The second most popular plant-based milk, at least for now, just after almond, is oat milk. And that's why I'm so glad that we have Julie Kunen, the Director of Sustainability of Oatly North America. Julie is also an expert on food, culture, and the environment. She was the Vice President for the Americas at the Wildlife Conservation Society, a nonprofit dedicated to saving wildlife and wild places. And she was the co-founder of the Rainforest to Table initiative, which promotes conservation of the Amazon through the celebration of its culinary heritage. Julie, it's so great to see you. As you know, you're one of my favorite people, and it's so great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
So you've had this incredible career so far, and I can only imagine where it will continue to go. But you have worked at USAID, you've worked, as I said, with the Wildlife Conservation Society. I'm wondering why you decided to work with Oatly?
Yeah, it's really true. My path through sort of the world of food and food sustainability has been winding, and I think it's only looking back on it that I see that all of those curves actually added up to something and made a ton of sense. I have worked in and around sustainability in food, I think in academia, in research, in government policy, in international development, conservation. Then I worked briefly as a business consultant and also as a freelance journalist. And I think throughout those iterations, I had this growing appreciation of the fact that what really moves change in the world is business, people's consumption patterns, people's tastes, the things people buy. And it just felt to me like business had the most agility and the most power to really make those system level changes that we need if we're going to address all of the planetary crises that we're in. So I was eager to sort of try my hand in a corporate role, which is new for me. And to me, Oatly seemed like exactly the kind of mission-driven, sustainability-oriented company that really could be an industry leader and a change maker. So I was excited for the opportunity.
Absolutely. And I have to admit, I was surprised when I found out you'd moved to Oatly, but also like excited. I think you're right in so many ways that business has so much power to do good and in a way that it hasn't before. And a company like Oatly, I'm wondering what power you think they have to change how we look at our food and agriculture systems.
Yeah, I think it comes at a couple of different levels. I mean, certainly there's just the inherent nature of the product itself, right? Like we sell oat milk and oat milk related products. And just in the fact of it being a plant-based product, right away you're starting from something that has a much less intensive resource use footprint compared to the dairy alternative that you would be comparing us to in the market. So there's that. I think at another level too, it's obviously a very popular and growing brand. I think it entered into the United States in 2016, and I think we're one of the top 2 or 3 industry leaders in terms of sales and in terms of reach. So there's just this tremendous potential to attract even more people and to introduce many more people to our products. And then even beyond that, I think Oatly very much sees itself as an industry leader and as someone or some entity that has the ability to really bring people along as part of a movement and to really speak to people about something that goes well beyond a glass of our milk or a pint of our yogurt or ice cream to just the nature of the fact that the world needs to move towards plant-based eating. So, I mean, I see the influence at all of those different levels, and quite frankly, all of them interested in me.
Absolutely. I'm wondering, you mentioned the sustainability factor of Oatly. Is it really more sustainable than dairy milk?
I mean, our research says yes. Certainly I'll start with some of the peer-reviewed, sort of big picture synthesis reports that have come out over the last, several years. And I'm thinking of things like the Eat Lancet report, or even the report that just came out a week or 2 ago from Chatham House in the UK, or WWF's, plant-based diet, all of which point to just the facts that plant-based alternatives use in general, less land, less fossil fuels, less water. They just tend to be much less resource intensive across the board than animal related products, both meat and dairy. For Oatly specifically, we've done some comparative analyses, life cycle assessments. Our most current data are from our European businesses and markets. So in Sweden, for example, or Germany or the UK, all of the life cycle assessments that we've done, show that our product compared to its dairy alternative is just much less intensive and much more environmentally friendly across that spectrum, not just climate, but the other natural resources that we also care about.
Well, and one thing that, I'm not surprised. I know oat milk is not necessarily a new product. It's been around for a long, long time, but it's become very cool. And I think when you couple that with the sustainability sort of, goals that Oatly has in mind, it becomes sort of a more powerful product in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think that's true. I actually remember the first time I ever had an Oatly oat milk latte, and I'm not what you would call an early adopter. I think it sometimes takes me a while to catch up to trends, but I was in Chinatown and I went for a latte at a local coffee shop, and I just, I think I was just intrigued by it, and I ordered it, and it blew me away. I could not believe how delicious it was. And it, this was years before I thought to myself, oh, maybe I'll, work at Oatly someday. So I was just like blown away with the deliciousness of the product. And I think that that's where a lot of oat milk's popularity, or, Oatly specifically popularity comes from. It's just really good. And, our history here in the U.S. is certainly that we started as more of a niche, product in coffee shops like the one I described. But, I think our goal, as a company, but also because we realize in order to change the game, you just have to be much more, broaden your reach, is to just introduce many more people to our products and to the sort of normality of eating plant-based foods.
Absolutely. And speaking of changing the game, Oatly's sustainable development goals include affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, responsible consumption and production, and climate action. And so I'm hoping we can talk about each of those. I like the climate action part in particular. It's not framed as climate change or the climate crisis. It's framed as climate action. And can you talk about that a little bit?
I can, and I have to give a shout out here to our Chief Sustainability Officer, Ashley Allen, who I had the pleasure of working with when we were together at USAID. She joined Oatly, I think, about 6 or 7 months ago, and she heads up the sort of global sustainability effort. So I know she's giving, a huge amount of thought to these arenas, but she talks to all of us about this notion of climate action. And I think it is, again, at these different levels that I talked about. Some of it is the housekeeping of our own footprint. And I can certainly talk a little bit more about what we're doing, in terms of investments in regenerative agriculture, and in terms of thinking about the way we design our own factories and our own production, and partner with our co-manufacturers to really think about the footprint of the production of our products. But the action is extending to things like policy interventions. Certainly in Europe, we've been active trying to level the policy playing field between dairy and dairy alternatives in terms of legislation, in terms of regulation. And I think probably we'll talk about this, but there's some interesting things obviously going on in the U.S. in the policy space. But we want to be in a conversation. I think that's part of Oatly's approach to this is, we're very mission driven and we're very sustainability oriented in terms of our own product, but we really want to have a conversation with people about the daily choices that they make about what they eat and drink, and the impact that has on the planet, and to get people thinking about it. So that's when we talk about action. I think we're really talking about engaging people in reflection and dialogue and personal choice conversations, and then the sort of framework in which we operate, whether that's activism or, regulation or support for our business partners or whatever it is.
Yeah, this idea of an activist company is really, I think, changing how people feel about, food and beverage companies and where they spend their dollars. And you mentioned this idea of creating a conversation. How do you do that with policymakers, either here in the United States or over in Europe?
Yeah, some of it is through some campaigns. We've certainly been active in various campaigns and some sort of provocative conversations. Perhaps you saw our ad during the Super Bowl, which was just to get people really talking about and thinking about oat milk as a possibility, if maybe they never thought about it before. But we're in the process, and I'm relatively new in my role, so I'm sort of just getting the lay of the policy land. It's certainly obviously in this country, we've just had a change in administration. And so, I'm personally tracking very carefully where the Biden administration is saying that it wants to go, particularly with USDA, particularly with things around potential incentives for carbon sequestering agricultural practices or just generally regenerative agricultural practices. I've participated in several conversations, one in fact hosted by you, with various Congress people to just hear about the policy agenda of this Congress going forward and to just, to be part of those conversations. So I have to say right now, for me personally, it's an assessment of the, where are those available levers, but also, because we're just so new in this administration to see where that's heading.
Absolutely. The other thing I liked about the sustainable goals that Oatly has is you have this concept of decent work and economic growth. And I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about that. That's not something you often hear companies say, decent work.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to speak first and foremost as an employee. And I just have to say how genuine it feels to me, the understanding of this company that employees are their most important assets. And it's particularly beneficial for me as the sustainability director in North America, because it's the kind of job where, it's in my title, and at least at the moment, my title alone, because I'm a one-person shop. But it's everybody, it won't happen, right? Unless everybody, whether it's, transport logistics or the folks that are working in the factories or, the people who work on our creative content or who source our ingredients, all of them obviously have to be part of getting towards the sustainability objectives of the company. So there's this inclusiveness that I really appreciate. And, I've worked in a lot of different work environments, of course, as I described, and this feels very genuine to me. I think maybe, other things I can point to are, we do, certainly during COVID, it's just been a huge challenge, of course, for everybody in the world. I think our leadership has done a really extraordinary job keeping people cohered. We have very active conversations, and they're on a human level. They're on a interpersonal human level that make people feel valued. And if folks are struggling with whatever's going on, there's just this genuineness to it. Even in obviously running a food production factory in a time of COVID is not an easy thing. And I just think we have extraordinary standards for safety, for quality, for, the wellness and well-being of the employees. So, I'm saying that mostly as an employee myself. And I just am very impressed with how the company is handling those things.
That's good to hear. Again, something you don't hear a lot from most standard companies. You talked a little bit about the company's footprint in terms of carbon. I'm wondering if you can describe some of the regenerative agriculture practices that your team is promoting.
Yeah, sure. And I can talk a little bit about it globally too. So, starting in Europe, Oatly has started to put climate footprint labels on many of its products. And we are working towards a point in time where all of our products will come with that information, whether it's on the package or available on our website. But we want people to be able to know transparently, what is in a time of climate crisis, what is the impact of this purchase that we're making? We'd love it if, other companies would also do that so that there's some measures for comparison. Because right now, if you see a number like 0.25 or whatever greenhouse gas emissions equivalent, or carbon, CO2 equivalent, you don't have really anything to compare that to. So, certainly we're trying to educate people through that. But in order to get to a good number, of course, we're working on a number of different investments. So right now in the United States, we're in a pilot investment with oat farmers in the U.S. Midwest. We're partnering with Sustainable Food Lab and Practical Farmers of Iowa. Those are two nonprofits that work in the sustainable food space.
Right.
And we're testing different models for how to incentivize and support farmers who are interested in incorporating certain regenerative agriculture practices into their farming. So those are things like adding oats into what would normally be a very typical corn and soy, limited rotation crop cycle.
Sure.
For the added diversity and for the added benefit of having a third crop. That also looks like incentivizing the use of a cover crop, either undersown with the oats or in rotation with the oats. Again, both to add agrobiodiversity, but also to improve soil health. And then we're measuring certain on-farm and then enterprise sort of metrics that come out of this experimentation, like, how cost effective was it for the farmer in terms of their yield? And then, things on the farm, like in the next year of rotation, was the introduction of those additional cropping cycles and diversity leading them to use less, let's say, nitrogen-based synthetic fertilizer, which is both an environmental benefit, but also a cost saving for the farmer. So we're experimenting right now with a cost share model that's helping farmers take on that risk. And we're also partnering with grain millers, who is our oat supplier, to ensure that those farmers have markets for their crops at the end of it. So if they're food grade oats, we buy them, and if they're not quite up to that standard, then grain millers helps them find other markets. So that's an example. We have similar projects going on in the other countries where Oatly works, and we're committed to a standard that's going to get us to a point where we can speak to all of our agricultural ingredients as things that are giving back more than they're taking out of, which is the definition of regeneration, right? Things,
absolutely,
putting more into the system than we're taking out of it, in terms of climate, in terms of biodiversity, but also in terms of farmers' well-being, which is important to us.
Absolutely,
for the main reasons that you noted before.
Well, and farmers of all kinds, and especially dairy farmers, have been struggling, but also corn and soybean farmers are struggling. So any way that you can give them an incentive to transition to something that's a little bit different, a little bit better, whether it's in terms of climate or, again, their own well-being, I think those incentives really work. And I think this goes back to your point about the power of working with a business, or a business like Oatly, where you can make these big changes and kind of do them quickly. And I think a really interesting point for me is have this ability to experiment, or help farmers experiment too.
Yeah, I think we are asking ourselves the question, what is the role of a company like us? We're not a huge company, but we're a committed company. What is the appropriate role? What are the barriers that farmers face? And can we find some way to help them overcome them? So we're asking, we're almost hypothesis testing ourselves to say, what is the best way to arrange this? I will say we could not do it without technical support partners, and our suppliers, because farmers are busy people. They've got a ton of risks that they have to manage, and so you really need to work with people who understand what they're going through, and to be very. The solutions have to work for them. Otherwise, no sort of good intention is going to yield the system change that you're looking for. So, as a scientist myself, I'm quite interested in the research design and just, testing these different modes of support and seeing which ones are the most effective.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, taking it from farmers and the company to the actual consumer, those climate footprint labels, you're involving the consumer in a way where they understand that the farmer who produced this crop is doing something that's good for the world.
Yeah, that's correct. And I will say, we're not yet at the point where we're doing that in the United States. We've only been in this market for a couple of years.
Sure.
We started that pattern in Europe, but it's definitely something that's a priority for me and a commitment that we've made as a company. And so I'm looking forward to making that information available. It's a very data intensive calculation, and we want to make sure we're doing it correctly, right? So we're very, Oatly is a science-based company, and you may know that it started actually out of a research lab in a university in Sweden, and so we take very seriously the idea that if we're going to stick something on a product, we really want to be thorough and thoughtful and have verification of the data analyses that we're doing to make sure we're providing good information to people.
Absolutely. So Julie, you've been at the company for 3 months now, and I don't know if this is a question you can answer in such a short time, but what do you think you can get through as the director of sustainability? What are your kind of hopes and dreams?
Yeah, no, thank you. I've spent basically the last 3 months asking myself that question and having as many conversations as I could with my colleagues and, some of our key partners. And I do think we have a general sense of where we want to go, and not surprisingly, what I'm proposing is cohesive with what the larger company wants to do. But, certainly a priority for me is really focusing on, these changes in the food system. We will definitely be upping our attention to regenerative agriculture, starting with oats, of course, because it's the most important agricultural ingredient in our products. So I would expect that we'll be expanding our investments in sort of different trials and things. And my aspiration is that we're going to get to a kind of best practice situation where we have a framework for how Oatly does regenerative oat farming well, and that will become sort of our standard operating procedure. That's definitely a priority. That's, I would say like a medium term priority. It's obviously not something we'll get done in, 6 months or anything. I think another arena that we're really focused on is the footprint of the factories, and really working with our ops team and working with our supply chain team to make sure, we're sourcing to really excellent standards, rigorous standards. And then we're using, the most, we're doing our best to sort of incorporate renewable energy in the factories, to reduce our water usage in the factories, to really think carefully about waste. We try to recycle as much as we can. There's an oat fiber byproduct that comes out of the making of our product, and we're thinking real hard, and I'm working with our product innovation team to figure out, like, what do we do with that? Let's think in a circular economy way and, have something useful come out of that, not think of it as waste. But like even, things like, can we transition more of our shipping to rail rather than freight for our raw materials? It's a much lower footprint. So that kind of like factory operations part is definitely key. And then for me, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about some of the really like internal kind of shifts. So I'll give you 2 examples. Actually, I can give you 3. We have a really committed set of employees at Oatly, and I want to see what the best way is for us to link our sustainability goals to employee performance, right? And to find a way so that employees, who don't necessarily have sustainability in their title, have set for themselves some objectives and key results that have to do with contributing sustainability value to the company, and that ultimately managers are evaluating their employees in part around, their contribution to those goals. So it seems like such a small thing, but to me, it's absolutely critical. This become like a measurable part of everybody's job. We want to do a similar thing with the way that sustainability data is used in terms of business planning systems. So, just like any company would do a business forecast and a review and, financial projection and sort of check in where they are, I want us to have try to build the systems so that we can do the same thing around our sustainability data, so that it's not just at the end of the year, like, let's reflect back, but that we're somehow in some semblance of real time, like having that information so that it can influence business decisions. And I mean, everyone's conceptually completely on board with this. It's just like, it's a complex thing to actually get done, but it's those are some of my sort of internal priorities. And then the third one that I wanted to mention, and I'm going to mention it because it just got tremendous enthusiastic response from my colleagues, which was very gratifying. There's a hunger for knowledge around sustainability, even in a company that is already, heading in that direction. And so I'm going to be doing a kind of, like a webinar series or like a continuing education set of modules for any employee who wants to participate, where like on a regular schedule, we're going to pick a particular topic that has to do with sustainability and do, maybe some advanced reading, like maybe an article that was in the paper or, some report that's come out with a little expert talk, either by myself or, one of my colleagues, and then a discussion. And the idea is that people are continuing to deepen their own understanding of sustainability, and that will just make it much easier for them to, to then kind of like use that lens when they're thinking about how they do their jobs. So I just proposed that to the team last week, and there was huge enthusiasm around it. So I'm really excited. And as a former professor, like the nerd in me is quite excited about getting back to some sort of teaching. But I think, I don't know, I'm sort of going on for a while, but like I just think there's a great hunger for information, and people really want to be part of that conversation and to make time for it. So I really want to support that.
Absolutely. No, it's very ambitious, but it's also game changing. And that's what companies should be doing, is changing the game, especially when it comes to, with this very broad term of sustainability, but when we're talking about regenerative ag or improving sort of the social welfare of employees, or, thinking about farmers' incomes, these things are all things that need to happen. And if companies don't think about them, I think they're sort of missing out, and they'll be the companies that are kind of left behind eventually.
Yeah, I do think this is sort of this is the modus operandi, I think, for business today. Like, I think most responsible businesses see themselves as, having this responsibility and having this, I don't want to call it almost an obligation, but I think, again, it speaks to a question you asked me earlier, which was about Oatly's, commitment to its employees and its, investment in, sort of well-being, I think this kind of nourishment is also part of that. People are hungry to know how they can be part of the solution, and knowledge is power. So happy to support that.
No, and I think now more than ever, and because of COVID and because of the sort of inequality that we've seen so dramatically, over the last year, that people are hungry to be a part of something where they do see a solution, and they do crave that information in ways that I don't think they did maybe 13 months ago.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of the side effects, of course, of this pandemic is, as you know all too well, the ruptures in our food system and in all of our supply chains were, so evident. And I think a lot of people said to themselves, wow, I just didn't realize how fragile or how tenuous the system was. And it just, of course, it caused people to think about it in ways that they never did. So, to the extent that people then use that experience to either change their commitments or their own behavior or the way they think about the world, then that will have been a positive thing that comes out of this this experience, however challenging it continues to be.
It continues to be, for sure.
That's with a smile.
Wear your masks, people. Wear your masks. I want to switch gears a little bit, sort of. You wrote in an article where you argued that the foodie movement, meaning the rising demand for maybe specialty foods, can play a key role in environmental conservation. So I'm wondering, how we can get companies and organizations to have sort of, more awareness of these foods that are out there. I know, take off your director of sustainability hat at Oatly for a minute, sort of more broadly in the food and world. How can we get consumers sort of more engaged, like you were talking about?
Sure. To me, the answer is sort of simple. The food, it has to be really delicious. That's always what I've led with. And when I wrote the article that you're referring to, I was, years away from being at Oatly. I believe I was still at the Wildlife Conservation Society. And my colleagues and I there actually started several really interesting projects where we were linking chefs of very popular urban restaurants in the capital cities of many of the Latin American countries that are very high in biodiversity, and where WCS itself was committed to conservation, and trying to foster relationships. I don't want to just say, supply chain relationships, but actual interpersonal relationships between those restaurants and indigenous people who were in their traditional practices, conserving land, conserving agrobiodiversity, and stewarding, some really interesting food traditions. And the only way something like that is going to work is if at the end of the day, the plate that's on the table at the restaurant tastes really good, right? There's a great story there, and we can always tell those stories. And we, as an organization and myself personally, were involved in a lot of different expeditions where we would bring, urban people to these places and help expose them to this richness and to this trajectory. But at the end of the day, it just has to really taste good. So I feel like leading with people's palate and leading with that experiential richness can lead people down the path to sustainability. And then you accompany that with a really authentic narrative. And there are many companies that do that. Even back in my USAID days, we were working with specialty coffee producers who were exporting and roasting and selling really fantastic coffee that came with an incredible story about the efforts that rural smallholder farmers in the Americas were, stewarding these shade-grown coffee lands that were providing, biodiversity benefits and, habitat for birds and other wildlife. And, that's a tremendous story that's kind of, been at the edges for a while, but I feel like it's going sort of much more mainstream now.
Absolutely. And again, during COVID, we've heard a lot of those stories being brought to light. But I think it's interesting that you mentioned taste plus story, because that's kind of, how we started this conversation. You talked about, your Chinatown Oatly latte and how, we were surprised how delicious it tastes. And, it's just sort of kind of coming full circle in a lot of ways.
Or it says something about the state of the way my brain thinks, which is, is it yummy? I want it. Is it good for the planet? Fantastic. But, I think it's, I'm being facetious, but it speaks to people's desires, right? And if you can link something that has a great outcome for the planet with someone's personal desires, I just think that's an incredibly powerful combination. And then that makes it a lot easier.
Absolutely. It makes it a lot easier to get these things through to folks if it tastes really, really good. So I've been asking people, what's been keeping them going during the pandemic? Is it a particular movie, a particular book, a podcast, a poem, a piece of art? Is there anything that comes to mind that has sort of kept you going over the last year?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I could definitely name check, Bridgerton or like many other Netflix experiences. But I will say in the early part of the pandemic, so I was in New York, which is where I'm from and where my family is, for the first couple of months of the pandemic, and New York, of course, had one of the strictest and earliest quarantine lockdowns. So
Sure.
I was there for a little while, and I made the decision to try to be part of the solution around the sort of food system crisis that we were talking about a few minutes ago. So I actually packed up my car and I drove for 5 days across the country in the middle of the pandemic to northern Montana. And I worked for several months as a farmhand on an organic farm. It just was like a farm laborer,
Wow.
trying to just get, food into the hands of people that really needed it. And I've continued to do some work here with the local community food bank, packing lunches for kids, packing Thanksgiving meals, packing food for the elderly. So part of my answer is concretely being part of a solution that I can see is getting good, healthy food into the hands of local people. I've always been a person that when I'm feeling really down about myself personally, if I can do something for someone else and feel like I'm part of a community, I almost always feel better. But the other part of the answer is that Montana is the most gorgeous state, and just to be here in this landscape and to be able to get outside for a hike or a ski or just to be out in nature and to breathe the air and see that sky and see those mountains and just like hear the bird song. I not surprisingly find nature very nourishing, and just I'm very fortunate to be in a place where I can get out and actually breathe the air, and that's been a lifesaver during this whole experience.
I'm so glad, but I love that you've been doing service. You're honestly the first person to answer that question in that way. So it really, it speaks to my heart. That's wonderful. This has been such a pleasure. I've learned so much about you and about Oatly and about just sort of your viewpoint on the world. Thank you so much. I hope folks will join me tomorrow again at 2 p.m. and I'll be talking to Taz Walker, the Senior Program Manager of the Farbers of Color Network at Rossi USA. And next Monday for our Business Leaders series, I'll be talking to Miles Ryder, the CEO of Driscoll's, and Bree Ryder-Smith, the company's Director of Quality Systems Design and Technology. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much, Julie. You're really a pleasure, and I'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks so much, Danny. I really enjoyed the conversation. It flew by, and it was an absolute pleasure. So thank you.
Thank you.